What's up, guys? My name is Shasta Anaquan, and I chose to study the indigenous peoples of Russia. So let's get started. Overview background. There are over 100 identified indigenous groups in Russia. Only 41 of the groups are legally recognized as the indigenous small number peoples of the North, Serbia, and the Far East. Requirements to be legally recognized would be that groups of people must number fewer than 50,000, maintain traditional way of life, inhabit remote areas of the country, and identify as a distinct ethnic group. Some indigenous groups are excluded from legal recognition as they demonstrate a larger populated group. Uh, Russian indigenous historical history. First contact between the indigenous peoples and non-indigenous began between the 11th and 14th centuries. Colonial assimilation policies began as early as the 13th century when the development of northern Russia began. Such policies began with the process of various indigenous groups having to pay levy or tax to ensure their livelihoods. Policy towards the indigenous population can be roughly divided into three periods: pre-revolutionary or Tsarist, Soviet, and post-Soviet. Each reign is characterized by different types of power and by basic methods and attitudes of the state towards indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples of Russia are varied and diverse. Many of the groups share common characteristics such as nomadism or semi-nomadism, the practice of animism, and demonstrating lifestyles that consist of living off the land and reindeer herding. Before colonization, indigenous peoples had already developed subsistence patterns in accordance to their natural environment. Regulations concerning social relations, mutual aid, and use of territories were already in place before settler arrival. As well as being nomadic or semi-nomadic, indigenous groups were organized in autonomous clans or territorial communities based on common law. Under these circumstances, the Tsarist policy during the Tsaridom reign rested on the indirect control of the indigenous population through traditional institutions of the community. Indigenous populations suffered from the smallpox epidemic and other colonial disasters in the 18th century, which resulted 80% of the population to disappear. And adherence to the traditional lifestyles of the indigenous groups became more important since the collapse of the Soviet economy in 1990. First reign, Tsar indigenous relations. The reign of Tsardom of Russia featured policies that were aimed at the development of new territories within the region, introducing the colonization of the indigenous population. Tsar's order read that native people of the region should be treated respectfully and accommodatingly. Policies in this period were aimed at preserving traditional government institutions and the subsistence program for the system. Other policies included indigenous people paying levy or tax to ensure their livelihoods. It was also usual to abduct, buy, or enslave women and children. From the collection of levies, territorial expansion began with the construction of well-enforced towns. The Tsarist government then set up the Serbian Department in 1637, the main governing body over the non-Russian population. The assimilation of the indigenous population into the Tsar Russian state was not a favorable transition. Different nations rebelled against the collection of levies and abuse from the colonizers. It was determined that by the Tsar government that if any nation wanted to secede power, they were to be exterminated. And an example of that would be the Anal clan of the Chuvan or Chuvan people. By early 19th century, two groups of populations, the indigenous and non, entered into commercial relations. So in other words, production of loans and leases. It then became necessary to establish legal regulations and judicial bodies, as well as to define the status of indigenous people. An act entitled Regulations of Indigenous Population 1822 defined the above points. It was the first legal act to define the status of the indigenous population, as well as to preserve traditional indigenous administration and economy for Russia's indirect control of the peoples. The act also declared regulations prohibiting Russian settlers from settling in the area of clan communities without permission. Although considerations of humanity and concern for exploited native land are made apparent, the major trend the major trend of development continued: loss of land, economic decline, dissolution of subsistence patterns, and the disintegration of the social framework. Second reign, Soviet indigenous relations. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had altered the region's attitude towards indigenous people. Through the 1920s and 30s, policy change had affected the First Peoples. Forced integration of indigenous nations into the newly formed Soviet society became prominent. World War II also forced cultural assimilation. The former Tsar administration underwent Sovietization. The collectivization and Marxism were advocated for during this period. Until the middle of the 20th century, collectivization became the major factor of reorganizing traditional indigenous economy and social life. The overall control and registration were introduced to the economic, social, and political lives of indigenous peoples. This had resulted various nations to be strictly regulated. As well, during this period, various indigenous communities were consolidated and removed from their traditional territory. This had interrupted or even destroyed the traditional inhabitation patterns of the many nations, as well as their life and culture that manifested from certain ecological niches. Indigenous groups whose subsistence was destroyed became dependent on mainstream service functions or sought refuge in more hostile mountain and tundra areas. Traditional reindeer herding, hunting, and fishing occupations were forcibly transformed into collective farms all across the Soviet Union. The government turned into the principal employer, owner, and manager of the natural resources. In order to secure its control over the indigenous population, the government allowed the policy of making nomadic reindeer herders and hunters settle in a specific area, and this policy lasted until 1990. Middle of the 20th century, some indigenous children began studying in boarding schools with Russian-speaking teachers. This resulted communication and cultural ties between indigenous generations to be disrupted. This as well had negatively impacted the mentality of the people and stimulated marginalization of certain indigenous groups. It was under the Soviet reign that Russia began industrial development and large-scale extraction of natural resources. A Trans-Siberian Railway was established. Major environmental impacts began in the mid-1950s with chopping down of forests for timber, and which resulted 30% of its forests to be destroyed. The oil and gas boom started in the mid-1960s. Forests continued to be razed, and the land was impacted by careless transportation. Rivers and bogs were polluted, and the large land areas were not fit for any sort of primary subsistence. Railways and pipelines also cut off reindeer migration routes. The indigenous population also suffered abuse through pillage, theft, killing of reindeer, and destruction of sacred sites. In 1975, after the arrest of Leonard Peltier in the U.S., protests erupted across the Soviet Union. Soviet representatives criticized Canada and the U.S. for their treatment of Indians during the session of the United Nations Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities in 1985. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 would again bring policy change to indigenous people. Third reign, post-Soviet Russian Federation indigenous relations today. 1990 would be a period when the Russian Federation became an independent state. Issues of indigenous people of the North, Serbia, and the Far East had reached new legal solutions. All major changes in Soviet and Russian national politics had further influenced indigenous peoples. Today, the Russian Federation claims to follow international norms on indigenous rights protection, though the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is ratified by the Russian state. In 1993, the Constitution of the Russian Federation was enacted. Various articles in the Constitution guaranteed rights for the use of land, traditional economic activities, and of indigenous languages. It was made aware that protection of the land where traditional communities and activities reside would be essential to Indigenous heritage. This would provide lifetime ownership with hereditary succession or lease of pastures for hunting and fishing practices by communes and families without charge. Excuse me. Regulations on the status of tribal lands was passed in 1992. Indigenous people were then able to perform traditional resource management pertaining to the hereditary succession of traditional territories. The Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, or RAPON, an umbrella organization of the Indigenous Peoples of the North, Serbia, and the Far East, was formed in 1990. RAPON represents 41 groups of the 100 indigenous groups that have been accounted for, and again, these 41 groups are the only groups of indigenous people that are legally protected. RAPON declares that there are 270,000 people within the legal recognized groups, and 60% of the whole Russian territory is occupied by these groups. The purpose for establishing RAPON is to protect the human rights of indigenous people, defend their legal interests, assist in solving environmental, social, economic, cultural, and education issues, and as well to promote the right to self-governance. RAPON works with Russian Federation regarding legislation relating to indigenous issues. In 1999, federal law had passed on the guarantees of rights of indigenous peoples of the Russian Federation. The act consolidated the legal basis of the status of indigenous people and promoted other federal laws. It was during this time the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, or the FCNM, by the Russian state also strengthened the guarantees of legal status of indigenous peoples. This was progressively formed in accordance with the Constitution of the Russian Federation and international legal standards. As a result, the Assembly of Indigenous Peoples of the North was formed. This assembly represents the status of indigenous peoples, demonstrates a new understanding of minorities' rights in Parliament, and therefore creates an ability to find compromises and consideration of indigenous opinion during relevant decision making. From the year 2000 to today, the current situation for indigenous people of Russia can be characterized as legal stagnation. Prior to 2000, main positive achievements for the indigenous people were the legal settling of issues regarding registration of persons and maintaining a traditional way of life. 2004, the Russian Federation withdrew legal legislation on the basics of the state regulation of social and economical development of the north of Russian Federation. Indigenous people were no longer able to attain plots of land for lifetime ownership with hereditary succession. Again, their traditional way of life and subsistence patterns were disrupted. Indigenous peoples are no longer in charge of their traditional resource management. In 2006, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Alexander Yakovenko stated at a session of Human Rights Council in Geneva that Russia will not support the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Reasons for this decision, according to Yakovenko, was that Russia could not agree with articles declaring the right to self-determination and land rights of indigenous peoples. So as a result, they voted against the declaration. In 2007, Russia reaffirmed its position abstaining from the implementation of the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Russia does not recognize the right for indigenous populations to own land and natural resources, though indigenous rights are protected in the Constitution of the Russian Federation. The conclusion: indigenous peoples of Russia had experienced various policy changes since the 13th century from various government administrations. Indigenous issues had further evolved rather than be eradicated as different forms of governments came into power. Since 2007, no serious policy changes had affected the indigenous population for the better. The largest obstacle for indigenous peoples of Russia continues to be acquiring back land rights. The relationship between the Russian Federation and its indigenous people demonstrate a broken relationship similar to the Canada Indigenous relations.